Hello, everybody. This is Nisa Richardson, and I am going to be sharing our administration code and inclusion code training with you today. This is the training that is required by the Department of Education and Assessment and Accountability each year, twice, in fact, once at the beginning of the year and once prior to state assessment, K-Prep. So we will do the first one virtually, and I will have some questions sprinkled in, and then you can expect the second training to be in person probably in April, right before testing. So I might not go into great depths with each of these slides. So I want to encourage you right now to please ask me questions if you have any at any point. It's really important that you understand what is expected of you as you work with students to ensure that they have all of their all of their accommodations and needs met. So the administration code training is the first part, and that just refers to proper testing practices for all assessments that are state assessments. Another state assessment some don't think about, access testing for our English as a second language students. That takes place typically beginning in January and takes several months since we have a large EL population. We also are now required to screen our incoming kindergarten students with the Brigance screener. So there are a variety of assessments that come up. We have some pilot testing that sometimes happens as well. So I want to go ahead and get started and just make sure that you are aware that I really want you to pay attention to this. So I know you have a lot of training that you attend, but this is important to work as you work with students. So in general, for our testing, even when it comes time for K-Prep or other state assessments that may happen, it is fine for students to know the concepts. However, you are not allowed to teach to a test that you've seen. So if you've seen a K-Prep test and you know that a certain question will be coming up the next day, you are not permitted to change your instruction based on what you've seen, or disclose any information that you see to any other people. That would be a not acceptable practice. Testing manuals are distributed. They are actually usually found online, but you must also, I'm sitting outside, if you can hear dogs, sorry. The manuals are not necessarily secure because they're published online, but all of the student information is secure materials. And that also includes the testing tickets, the seal codes, and the scratch paper that you will get when it comes time to test. All of those materials need to be kept locked and secure in my office, and they are not to be kept locked in your office or filing cabinet unless we've had a conversation about it, and typically the answer to that is no. So students are allowed and, in fact, encouraged to use technology for test items now. We did K-Prep online last year, and Access has also been online for a majority of students. All of those materials that we talked about, the test ticket, the seal code, the scratch paper, that should not be taken outside of the testing room. And I will provide those materials to you. There are some documentation about erasure analysis, although we don't erase typically on an online typed on test. There are opportunities for students to write. For example, in the access test, they respond on paper pencil for the younger grades. So it's just important that we are, as test administrators, not leading students with gestures or verbal cues or anything to a certain answer. KDE does do site visits. They do those yearly. They are chosen randomly, and so we want to just be in alignment with the administration code throughout the year. So it's just a reminder to not take photos of test items, and it is okay for you to receive the test manual prior to the first day of testing, but it is not okay for you to just read the bolded parts and not understand the rest of the script. As an administrator, if you're working with a group of students, 2 or more, typically you will be circulating throughout the testing site. If you're one-on-one, you will sit next to the student. This is so that you can monitor all students at once. As far as encouragement goes, you can say things like do your best, get started, stay on task, but you can't say good job, can you add more, those type of coaching or editing comments. If a student needs a restroom break, you will monitor them at all times, at least, outside of the door, and they need to go in individually during an assessment from KDE. I'll cover that. So if someone were to miss a test during the test, then we would want to make that up with the student. This is what's really important. The second part of our training will be the inclusion code training, and that will be regarding items that are required for students to have in order to meet their individual education plan or program service plan, which is the plan for our ESL students. So we'll talk in depth what those strategies are. It's just really important that you understand what is expected of you. And this is just referring to the test itself. It's saying that they should be given in order and that the accommodations should be provided consistently and throughout the year. So that's a big part of why we do this training at the beginning, because we can't say they've been getting the accommodations throughout the year if we don't start providing them beginning in August. So it's really important that you understand what accommodations the students need. You don't want to point out to a student that they haven't written enough, or give them more time than they are provided. We'll talk more about that in depth later. We do have some resources that students can use now. The online calculator is what actually all of our students, except for a very small handful, used the online calculator last year. And if they used a handheld calculator, it was important that they have that written in on their IEP for your special education students. This is talking about not being on your device while you're in the middle of a testing session, so that you're actually attending to the students. And all walls need to be clear of content when you're giving an assessment. And that might be Access or K-Prep. Here are some types of things that are allowed to be on the walls. And then, oh, I did not know that was a link. And also some things that are not. And should you be using your personal cell phone during testing? No. Can you use can a gen ed student use a handheld calculator instead of the online one? No, not unless they have a individual education plan. And this is just talking about what students do after. In general and Natcher, we do not have students read a book, because we would have to check those books for content, and we don't want students to rush through their testing to read. It is okay to continue normal instruction during a testing session, and you can monitor for good faith effort, but it is not a scoring situation where you sit down and score their work. Rather, you just kind of visually scan it. You are not to tell students they are doing a good job on a test response, and that's very difficult to do because we want to be encouraging as educators, but that is the rule for assessment. And we can use good faith effort checklists, but we cannot specify a certain writing technique or strategy that they use. Seating charts are very important for all the assessments that are provided from KDE. That helps them monitor for students who might be cheating or any irregularities that happen during the session. Here's some information that will be on that seating chart, and we'll go over more closely later. Allegations are mistakes, basically, that are made in this administration code, errors that people make. We're human, kids are human, and that happens, but we want to avoid them at all costs. So we want to make sure you understand what you need to do to avoid those. Some of the things that happen include giving inappropriate accommodations, or maybe not following the test schedule, or leading a student to a certain response. Here are just a reminder of the things that are supposed to be secure. The seal code, which is what the student will log in with to actually get the test to start. A test ticket is the student's login information so that it individualizes it for that student. Some students have test booklets depending on grade level or if they have certain accommodations that they need a booklet for. And that summarizes the administration code training. We have the inclusion of special populations training, which I really hope that you listen to and ask questions about, because this is the part that happens pretty much during the school year and through testing. So the purpose of these accommodations is to level the playing ground. It is to make sure that students who might have a disability have an equal opportunity to the content. And so that's why we have ARC meetings every year, so that we can adjust those accommodations and ensure that the student's needs are being met as the student grows. So an IEP won't stay the same for many years in a row. It should change as the student changes. Same thing for the program service plan, the PSP, for ESL students. We also have 504 plans, and those are for students who may have some kind of medical condition that requires them to have some type of accommodation, but not necessarily have instruction by a resource teacher. So the accommodation is not meant to lessen the study load for students. An accommodation would maybe be reading the text that everyone else in the class got, the same text. Whereas a modification might come if you give that student a lower level text of the same content, but maybe the vocabulary words aren't as challenging. So we do not modify for state testing, but you will modify for your kids in the classroom during the school year, and that is okay. But you do want to be sure to make sure that that is within their IEP or their PSP. You don't want to set a student up for failure when they get to the end of the year and they don't receive those modifications on state assessments. And so the answer to that is modifications cannot be given in place of accommodations on tests. They're used routinely. These accommodations, they are not substitutes for high quality instruction, and they're appropriate to the student individually. It's not like you say, well, this student has another health impairment. Maybe they have ADHD. Not every student with ADHD needs the same accommodations. So you have to modify that for the individual child. Everyone needs to be informed. And that's why at the beginning of the year, you get IEPs at a glance and you get PSPs from the resource and the ESL team. That is you being informed. So if you don't understand something on there, that's where you need to ask questions, because you don't want to get to March and realize that you were supposed to be providing a reader for a student and they haven't received it all year and now they can't use it on state assessment. And not to mention the gaps that probably have occurred throughout the year because they haven't had that accommodation. Can a student be provided an accommodation right before testing? Yes, but it's not recommended because typically we want the student to have been using it all year. And we talked about changing the IEP and PSP as the child changes. Should teachers develop a plan to reduce accommodations for students? No, teachers don't. Teachers are part of the ARC committee that makes those decisions. So it's not on a one person, it is on a group, and that includes the parents, typically a school psychologist, principal, and the teacher. And it's not based on just what someone says. So maybe the teacher doesn't think that the kid can do very much. It's based on data. So that's what's really important when we have some of those tests and testing and observations. And everyone just needs to understand the plan for their students. English language learners use the program service plan. If they are brand new and have not been in the country for 270 school days, which seems like an arbitrary number, but that is the number, then they will not have to take the entire K-Prep test. They get one exemption from a state assessment. So I will talk to you and work with the ESL team if you have a student in that situation. And then we talked a little bit about 504 plans already. And Miss Bevel handles the 504 plans. So if you have a student with one, she will be getting with you to get that plan to you beginning of the year. We talked about that. Anyone who has been trained and works with a student can provide accommodations. So if your student has an assistant that pushes in, or maybe it's the RTI teacher that pushes in, someone who can be informed and then can assist that student, that is acceptable. You just have to make sure they have an understanding of what the accommodation should be. And not all accommodations are allowed on state assessment. For example, some of our PSPs have interpreters as an accommodation, which is fine during the regular school year if we have one available. However, it is not allowed on K-Prep. So some of the different types of assistive technology that can be used, text-to-speech, and we have some students, if they are deaf or hard of hearing, they might use the FM modulator or the sound field system. So we have a few of those. A lot of kids are now using Chromebooks, and that's still an accommodation for some if they have someone else typing it for them. So there are some situations where a student might have a scribe and another adult could type for them because they can't get their thoughts down as quickly as their brain forms them. So that would be something that would have to be in the plan. Manipulatives, we haven't had students with manipulatives in several years, but if we have that throughout the year, there might be some kids that have different types of manipulatives. Maybe it's counters or base 10 blocks or number lines, and that's totally fine during the school year. You use these in just good instructional practices. So hopefully that is something that you'll use throughout the year, but they probably won't be able to use it on K-Prep. For a reader, if a student has a reader, they can use that reader on all parts of the assessment, and that includes the online test. The reader will read the directions, the prompts, situations, and passages, but they cannot have any kind of inflection in their voice or any way leading a student to an answer. You cannot just give a student a reader just because they read slowly. A scribe is given to students with a variety of plans, and now that we're typing most of our answers now, we often find that the adult will type for the child if they prefer it, because the kids still have trouble composing their thoughts quickly. And so it just has to be the original work of the child. The adults cannot punctuate or capitalize words. They are supposed to type it exactly as the student says, and then let the student direct the punctuation and capitalization. The reader is allowed to read prompts, passages, everything. You cannot reread something if you've already read it once unless the student asks. So it is a good practice if you have a student in your classroom who has a reader to have them start practicing, will you please read that again, so that they are comfortable with that process. And a proctor can read back what the student had them write only if the student has a reader. Otherwise, the student will need to read it themselves. Calculators, we talked a little bit about handheld calculators and how there are a handful of students who use them. And then paraphrasing and simplified language. This is really just for the directions. And then paraphrasing is on the IEP and simplified language is on the PSP. And so you may see that, but it's really the same thing regardless of which one. And that's just helping the student understand the task or whatever they're supposed to do. We also have some students who use bilingual English dictionaries. These can be electronic throughout the year. I would recommend it, but typically on K-Prep, we encourage them to use a paper one. If they use an electronic one, it has to be a word-to-word translation with no internet access. Is each student that has an IEP allowed to use a calculator? No. We have some students who are reading-only students, and those students would not have need for a calculator. So you have to read carefully to know. The proctor would not ever be allowed to summarize in any context. So if a student, even if you read the whole passage to them and they don't understand it, putting that passage into your own words for them to understand is not something we do for assessment. It is something you do during regular instruction, but just to know that that is not something we would continue during testing. Extended time, most of our students with plans have some form of extended time. It's either double time or time and a half. So you can start having students practice not using more than what would be a double time situation, or you might modify their work so that they can get it done in the normal amount of time during the school year. And we have students who have reinforcement and behavior modifications. This just means accommodations and reinforcements that will help the student focus. It might be taking a walk, it might be providing an iPad break, or just allowing the student to stand up and stretch or move around the room. We have students who are deaf and hard of hearing, and these students also have the ability to have an interpreter as part of their accommodation. And so if you have a student who is DHH, you can talk to Ms. Stewart or someone on that team who can help you understand what your role is for those students. And I think most of that we have talked about. So that kind of summarizes the two trainings, Administration Code and Inclusion. I want to encourage you to please sign the form that I'm going to be putting in your mailbox, and I need that returned to me as soon as possible. I will also link it here so that you can print one if you would prefer. If you have any questions as you go through the school year, please reach out to me or a resource teacher, ESL teacher, Ms. Bevel, someone who can help you understand. My philosophy is always ask questions instead of making mistakes. So do your best always, but always don't be scared to ask someone else for some help. All right, I think that covers it, and let me know if I can help you.